right, so I suggested to you last class that human beings have the world as a place of action through the lens of their social cognitive biological substructure. And I made that argument on the basis of the supposition that our primary environment was actually other people. And I mentioned to you, I believe that those other people are arranged in hierarchies of influence and authority or power, or dominance, which is often how it's construed, and that the dominance hierarchy as a structure is at least 300 million years old, which makes it older than trees. And it's for that reason that you share the same neurobiology to govern your observations of your position in the hierarchy as lobsters do, which is a remarkable fact. You know, it's remarkable that the lobster uses serotonin as the mechanism to adjudicate its status position, and that modifying the serotonin function in the lobster can produce changes in its behavior, can help the lobster overcome defeat, for example, which is very much equivalent to what happens to a human being when they take antidepressants. You know, it's a good example of the conservation of biological structure by evolution, and a good illustration of the continuity of life on Earth. It's really amazing. But the other thing it is a testament to is the ancient nature of the social structure. Now, we tend to think of the social structure as something other than nature, right? Because society is, I suppose, mythologically opposed. It's opposed in a narrative way. Culture is opposed to nature. It's the town in the forest. But the town has been around a long time, so to speak, and the structure of the town is also part of nature, in that the dominance hierarchy is part of nature. And because it's so ancient, you have to consider it as part of the mechanism that has played the role of selection in the process of natural selection. And so roughly what seems to happen is that there is a plethora of dominance hierarchies, especially in complex human communities, and many of them are masculine in structure, in that they're dominance hierarchies that primarily men compete in, or that has been the historical norm, and that some men rise to the top based on whatever the dominance hierarchy is based on, and they make their preferential mates. And it's a good strategy for women to engage in, because and many sorts of female animals do precisely this, is they let the males battle it out and then pick from the top. Or often the dominant males, there's no choice on the part of the females, it's the dominant males just chasing away the subordinate males. But with humans, it's usually the case that the females have the opportunity to do at least some choosing. And so we have, if you think about that, what that implies is that we have evolved to climb up dominance hierarchies. And then I would say it's not exactly that even, because there are many different dominance hierarchies. And so the skills that you might use to climb up one might not be necessarily the same skills that you would use to climb up another. And so then I would say what we have evolved for instead, and I'm still speaking mostly on the masculine edge of things, historically speaking, is the ability to climb up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies, right? And that's a whole different idea. It's like the averaged hierarchy across vast spans of time. And I think it's for that reason that we, among others, that we evolved general intelligence, because general intelligence is a general problem-solving mechanism, and it seems to be situation independent, so to speak. And of course, there's been an arms race for the development of intelligence between men and women, because each gender has to keep up with the other, and women have their own dominance hierarchies. There's certainly no doubt about that. And of course, now men and women more increasingly compete within the same hierarchies, and we don't exactly know how to sort that out yet, because it's an extraordinarily new phenomena. But in any case, because of the permanence of the dominance hierarchy, it has come to be represented in fundamental narratives, because human beings, and this is something that we share everywhere, it's the thing the Wall Street banker shares with the Kalahari Kung Bushmen, who are among the, genetically speaking, they seem to be very close to what the most original human beings were like in Africa before the diaspora about 50,000 years ago. But both of those people, despite their vast differences, live in communities that have a hierarchical structure that are composed of individuals that are embedded in a natural world, the world outside of the dominance hierarchy. And so that's the standard human environment, I would say. And so stories that rely on the representations of those environments and their interactions are what you might describe as universal stories, and that's why people can understand them. And I would say further, and this is drawing substantially on, say, derivations of the work of Carl Jung, because I think he delved into this more deeply than anyone else, so a lot of this stuff is quite Jungian in its origins. The commonality between human beings, so you have to have commonalities in order to communicate, right? Axiomatic commonalities, because otherwise you have to explain everything. And so there's many things that human beings don't have to explain to one another. We don't have to explain anger, we don't have to explain jealousy, we don't have to explain fear, we don't have to explain pain, we don't have to explain joy, we don't have to explain love, etc. Those are built into us, and so they're predicates of being human. And you could say that those human predicates and the standard human environment produce standard narratives. And then you could say even further, and this is more of a leap, I would say, is that those who act out the role of the victor in those standard narratives are precisely the people who attain victory in life. And I would say biologically defined, in that they make more attractive partners, but also I believe that there's an alignment between human well-being, which is a very weak word, and participation in these meta-narratives that drive success. Because, well, do you want to be a failure or a success? Well, it's hard to be a success. You have to adopt a lot of responsibility, and so you might be willing to take your chances as a failure, but I'm not going to make the presumption that that's going to put you in a situation other than one where you experience a lot of frustration, anger, disappointment, depression, pain, and anxiety at the bottom of the heap. And so generally that's not what people are aiming for, although under certain circumstances, if people don't like responsibility and are willing to take their chances, they might take the irresponsibility and its apparent freedoms over the necessity of thinking things through the medium and long run. Anyways, we stopped here. I suggested to you that one of the primary narrative representations was the known, or culture, or order. I think those, or the explored territory, or the dominance hierarchy. I think those things are basically interchangeable from a representational perspective. And in the movie The Lion King, that's represented by Pride Rock, which is this central place of orientation, founded on rock, which is the sort of thing that people embed their memories in. That's why we make sculptures and gravestones and that sort of things. Rock stands for permanent, and to have rock under your feet is to be on a solid foundation, and that's a pyramid in some sense in that movie, and the pyramid is topped by the king and queen and their offspring. So that's the divine couple. That's one way of thinking about it. And Simba, of course, is the newborn hero. And you understand that, even though it's lions and drawings of lions at that, and animals are acting it out, it's completely irrelevant to you that those characters happen to be animated and that what you're watching is a fiction. So, and I would say to you, with regards to fiction, you might say, well, is fiction true or not? And the answer to that is yes and no. It's not true in that the events portrayed in fiction occurred in the world. They didn't. But fiction is true the same way numbers are true, I would say. Like, you know, if you have one apple and one orange and one banana, the commonality between all of those three is one. And you might say, well, is one as real as one fruit? Is the abstraction one as real as one fruit? And I would say it depends on what you mean by real, but representing things mathematically and abstractly gives you incredible power, and you could make the case that the abstraction is actually more real than the phenomena that it represents. And certainly mathematicians would make that case. They would say that mathematics is in some sense more real than the phenomenal world. And you know, you don't have to believe that. Mostly it's a matter of choice in some sense, but you can't deny the fact that an abstraction has enough reality so that if you're proficient in using it, you can change the world in insanely powerful ways. You know, I mean, all the computational equipment you people are using are dependent on the abstractions 1 and 0, essentially. And I mean, look at what emerges from that. And so I would say, with regards to fiction, if you take someone like Dostoevsky, who I think is a favorite of mine, by the way, I would highly recommend that you read all 5 of his great novels, because they are unparalleled in their psychological depth. And so if you're interested in psychology, Dostoevsky's the person for you. Tolstoy's more of a sociologist, but Dostoevsky, man, he gets right down into the bottom of the questions and messes around. Transformative reading. Anyways, Dostoevsky's characters, this character named Raskolnikov is a character in Crime and Punishment, and Raskolnikov is a materialist rationalist, I would say, which was a rather new type of person back in the 1880s, and he was sort of taken by the idea that God was dead, and convinced himself that the only reason that anyone acted in a moral way, in a traditional way, was because of cowardice. They were unable to remove from them the restrictions of mere convention and act in the manner of someone who rose above the norm. And so he's tortured by these ideas. He's half starving. He's a law student. He doesn't have enough to eat. He doesn't have much money, and so, you know, he's not thinking all that clearly either. And he's got a lot of family problems. His mother's sick, and she can't send him much money. And his sister is planning to engage in a marriage that's loveless to someone who's rather tyrannical, who she hopes will provide the family with enough money so that he can continue in law school. And they write him brave letters telling him that she's very much in love with this guy, but he is smart enough to read between the lines and realizes that his sister is just planning to prostitute herself in an altruistic manner, and he's not very happy with that. And then at the same time as all this is happening, he becomes aware of this pawnbroker who he's pawning his last possessions to, and she's a horrible person, and not only by his estimation, she pawns a lot of things for the neighborhood, and people really don't like her. She's grasping and cruel and deceitful and resentful, and she has this niece who's not very bright, intellectually impaired, whom she basically treats as a slave and beats all the time. And so Raskolnikov, involved in this mess and half starved and a bit delirious, and possessed of these strange new nihilistic ideas, decides that the best way out of this situation would be just to kill the pawnbroker, take her wealth, which all she does is keep it in a chest, free the niece, so that seems like a good idea. So remove one apparently horrible and useless person from the world, free his sister from the necessity of this loveless marriage, and allow him to go to law school where he can become educated and do some good for the world. So one of the things that's lovely about Dostoevsky is that he, sometimes when one person is arguing against another, or when they're having an argument in their head, they make their opponent into a straw man, which is basically they take their opponent and caricature their perspective and try to make it as weak as possible and laugh about it, and then they come up with their argument and destroy the straw man and feel that they've obtained victory. But it's a very pathetic way of thinking. It's not thinking at all. What thinking is when you adopt the opposite position from your suppositions, and you make that argument as strong as you can possibly make it, and then you pit your perspective against that strong iron man, not the straw man, and you argue it out, you battle it out. And that's what Dostoevsky does in his novels. I mean, he's the people who stand for the antithesis of what Dostoevsky actually believes are often the strongest, smartest, and sometimes most admirable people in the book. And so it takes great moral courage to do that. And you know, in Raskolnikov, what he wanted to do was set up a character who had every reason to commit murder, every reasonable reason, philosophically, practically, ethically even. Well, so Raskolnikov goes and he kills the old lady with an axe, and it doesn't go the way he expects it will, because what he finds out is that post-murder Raskolnikov and pre-murder Raskolnikov are not the same people at all. They're not even close to the same people. He's entered an entirely different universe, and Dostoevsky does a lovely job of describing that universe of horror and chaos and deception and suffering and terror and all of that. And he doesn't even use the money. He just buries it in an alley as fast as he can, and then doesn't want anything to do with it again. And anyways, the reason I'm telling you all this is potentially to entice you into reading the book, because it is an amazing, amazing book. But also because you might say, well, is what happened to Raskolnikov true? Are the stories in that book true? And the answer to that is, well, from a factual perspective, clearly they're untrue. But then if you think of Raskolnikov as the embodiment of a particular type of person who lived at that time, and the embodiment of a certain kind of ideology which had swept across Europe and really invaded Russia, and which was actually a precursor, a philosophical precursor to the Russian Revolution, then Raskolnikov is more real than any one person. He's like a composite person. He's like a person whose irrelevancies have been eliminated for the purpose of relating something about the structure of the world. And so I like to think of those things as sort of meta-real. They're more real than real. And of course that's what you expect people to do when they tell you about their own lives, about their own day. You don't want a factual description of every muscle twitch. You want them to distill their experiences down into the gist, which is the significance of the experience. And the significance of the experience is roughly what you can derive from listening to the experience that will change the way that you look at the world and act in the world. So it's valuable information, and they can tell you a terrible story, and that can be valuable because that can tell you how not to look at the world and act in it. Or they can tell you a positive story. You can derive benefit either way, which is why we also like to go watch stories about horrible psychopathic thugs, you know, and hopefully we're learning not to be like them. Although there are additional advantages in that, you know, you might say that someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control.